We've all heard of DeFi, or decentralized finance. We've been amazed at its extraordinary growth from $10 billion to $250 billion in just 2 years. We've likely heard pundits argue that DeFi will change the world and upend the banking and financial services industry. But what exactly is DeFi? How has it grown so quickly? And will it really live up to all the hype? Welcome to W3B Talks, an ongoing exploration of the impact of Web3 and blockchain technologies on business, government, and society. My name is Doug Heintzman. I'm the Chief Catalyst at the Blockchain Research Institute. In this episode, we are looking at how Web3 and blockchain have given rise to the DeFi industry. To help us better understand this topic and to answer some of these questions, I'm delighted to welcome Clare Adelgren to the podcast. Clare is the head of blockchain sales and operations at EY. EY, of course, is a leading consulting and services company doing business in 150 countries. They have a large and very successful blockchain business. I should also note that EY was a winner at this year's Web3 and Blockchain Transformation Awards. Welcome to the podcast, Clare.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. Excited to be here.
Well, great. Now, this is a topic that I find so interesting. It's in the news, at least in parts of the news. And there's a general awareness of the term, and that there's lots of people driving around in Lamborghinis that apparently made all their money in DeFi, and there's lots of, YouTube, stories. But 250 billion, that's an enormous industry. And I've never, ever seen an industry grow that quickly in such a short period amount of time. So let's start at the top. What is DeFi, and is it the same as crypto, or how's it different?
Excellent question. So DeFi, decentralized finance. So in a decentralized world, I think that the first thing that you have to understand is the concept is there's no centralized authority, no owner, no gatekeeper. And in the case of decentralized finance, it refers to a system of financial services that runs on blockchain technology and is self-governing, right? It's actually different from, your question is very interesting, right? So DeFi is a kind of a natural next step in the revolution of disruptive financial technology, right? It began 13 years ago. We started with Bitcoin as a digital asset. Bitcoin is probably one of the most famous cryptos that you can have. And it's really the next step in that evolution, so that you can think about the idea of being able to automate routine financial transactions by standardizing how those assets are described. And that's really the essence of it. And so most of it is built on Ethereum. That's not by chance, right? It was because Ethereum brought along with it this concept of smart contracts. And smart contracts allow you to codify shared business logic that can run autonomously on the blockchain network. And so this programming of business logic makes it possible to encode trust into the blockchain and then enabling you to define out transactions. And so you can start to see how you're able to build financial service processes in and around what would be a digital asset that's tokenized.
Okay.
So you have...
Yeah. So I was just going to say, I'm just trying to put this into a framework just so that I can conceptualize it properly. And I've been talking to a lot of banks around the world about kind of what's going on and looking at the trajectory of the banking industry over the last 10 years or so. And in some ways, this most recent kind of upheaval in the banking and financial industry, started with governments basically saying that, banks have either too much power, or they're not innovating fast enough, or they're extracting, too much economic rent from the population. And so they introduced open banking regulation and forced banks to expose their data sets through APIs, through legislation. And that gave rise to the fintech industry. And lots of actors started to find interesting ways of leveraging that data and building interesting products into, marginal economic niches, which really expanded the landscape. And it was kind of into that world that this blockchain technology kind of intersected it and, kind of put the whole things on steroids, because it, as you said, it offered these new primitives like smart contracts and cryptocurrencies. So, if you're a banker and you're kind of looking at this world and you're looking at, fintech on steroids, how do you see this whole space evolving?
Yeah. So, I think we're certainly at the early stage. Ultimately, it's all going to merge as one, right? I don't think this is not an either or. This is not that DeFi is going to take over and we're going to become an entirely decentralized financial systems and that everything is going to be run there. It's not an either or, right? The way that I see it is that suddenly this opportunity, the combination of the fintech activity that you're describing, right? There was a lot of new services, a lot of digitalization and digital payments and everything came out of that wave, right? And then we had 2009. I do think it's worth noting, Ethereum, really started 2009. That's straight off the bat of that downturn, right? And there was this huge need to take back some of that power. And so I think that this is not coincidence. I do think that what we see with DeFi is suddenly we have the opportunity through technology of being able to build entirely new services, right? And so this is an and, right? Is it competitive? Yes, in some places. Is it complementary? Absolutely, in some places. And so I think over time, what we're going to see is a melding of the two. And the journey to get there is going to be very, very interesting because there's going to be a lot of players along the way. Just as we've seen in fintech, the very early days of fintech, there were many, many players. And that's what we're seeing today in the DeFi space, is that there's a lot of activity out there.
Well, certainly. And that's one of the things that's so exciting is there's well over 2,000, DeFi companies out there. As I said, it's an enormous industry already. And we've seen amazing innovation in, pick something, KYC and compliance, identity, credit lending, prediction markets, custodial services, insurance, derivatives, oracles, margin trading. There's just a huge amount of innovation addressing all of these, many, many economic niches. As soon as someone identifies even the smallest opportunity, it seems that someone can kind of enter that space and find some clever way of leveraging this technology to address it in ways that, traditional financial and banking institutions couldn't possibly do. So that's what's happening. But what is it about this new technology that is allowing that to happen?
Well, I think, first of all, I think there's two really important things, I think, that have enabled this sort of growth and this. And one of the things that's allowing this innovation to happen is the very fact that you've had this vacuum from the regulators, right? This is a space which predominantly, not unlike any other new technology that's come about, right? We can look at a lot of parallels here that we've seen in recent years, but that regulation and the set of rules in which you have to operate that can sometimes be the restriction of innovation just haven't been there. And so that's allowed them to flourish and move very, very quickly. And I think there's a lot of upsides to that. And we've also seen the downsides to it. But you have to remember, if you think back to music streaming, at the very beginning of music streaming, there was a flurry of activity. There was very little thought put into really the rights of the owners of music. That all had to be sorted out. And once that got sorted out, today, most of what we consume is streamed music. And most of the revenue that goes to owners is through streamed music. And so it's kind of reached its kind of growth, and it's been able to grow out of being niche to being actually established. And I think that's a journey that you can very much expect here as well.
So it seems to me that what you're suggesting is that there's a bit of a confluence of factors that, on the one hand, you've got this new technology that can support digital assets and has, kind of radical composability as one of its, key enabling features. And on the other hand, there's the climate itself, kind of where we were in the maturity of some other industries. And, the thinking process behind some of the regulators in the space and the political leaders, that there is a bit of an intersection in history at this time in history that is really allowing this to emerge the way that it has. Is that
Definitely.
Is that what you're saying?
No, I would definitely agree with you on that. There's this, on the one hand, you've got this insatiable demand for financial services to go with all of these cryptocurrencies that people had, a need and a desire to have an alternate choice, right? As I said to you about the timing, when you think about the downturn of 2008, people really felt the need to want to be able to have that control back and look for ways where, as a consumer, I can regain some of that control back. And you have this evolution and the promise of a technology that does just that, right? Nobody owns it. It's decentralized. The trust, the verification of that network, everything that's on it is something which is built in and codifiable into these componentized sort of pieces. So the way to think of it is, these are like, a smart contract becomes like a digital Lego brick, right? Once you can pick it up and you can move it and you can embed it in other processes, you suddenly have a flexibility here. And all of that you can do by embedding trust within it. And that means that you're suddenly giving back ownership to who owns those assets. And I think that there's a huge demand for that. And that sort of demand is what is the pull, if you like. And if you're able to do that before regulators and others can catch up, then, you have this sort of that huge whirlwind of activity that we all saw through 2021 and 2021. Well, fantastic.
Going back to the analogy that you referred to with the music industry, and the fact of what happened with digitization, and how it kind of changed the way that we consume music, but it also changed some behavior, and I think this is what you're pointing at, that there was the advent of digitization of music. The dominant model became a peer-to-peer environment, right? People were sharing music, which of course, ran into problems with the business model of the music industry. But that was, people's natural propensity was to figure out ways of exchanging value in a peer-to-peer space and disintermediating a lot of the traditional, third-party players. And I think that a lot of the value proposition in these early phases of the evolution of the DeFi space, and early, right? It's only a couple of years old, but so I guess we're definitionally early, even though it's a massive industry already. It seems to me that a fair amount of the core value proposition, when you kind of Google what is DeFi, the words, peer-to-peer and avoiding fees, which in my mind is a bit of a placeholder for, taking out the job that big banks and finance companies were doing, and then distributing the fees that they were collecting to the other participants in the ecosystem. That those are kind of key characteristics of this new space. Now, did you see that, continuing, growing, or do you see, regulators kind of reining that in a bit and starting to implement some more centralized controls around AML and KYC and all the things that they need to regulate?
I think there's going to be a mix. So I think at the end of the day, without a doubt, we're moving towards a more liberalized, democratized set of services. Why do I say that? It's because the very nature of blockchain and very nature of these decentralized networks is, first of all, you've got to remember that suddenly for the first time, there's sort of global, it's public, it's 24/7 by 365 access. You can access it anywhere from anywhere. You can't rein that back in, right? So you've suddenly got this great accessibility. You've got this sense or this essence of it, which is really being able to sort of free individuals to make the choices that they need to make, right? So I do think that we're going to have this rebalancing of control. I think that once people have the experience that they've already got, to be honest, consumers are already on board with this. So they've already embraced it. I think what we're looking at now is there'll be a balance to it, because those consumers that are in there now, some of them we've got to also acknowledge, right? There's been issues. There's been issues that we've seen come through in the last, and there's a lot of learnings through that, and we're just, coming through this perceived crypto winter that we're in at the moment, right? So you will see consumers and businesses and others will want to start to see a certain degree of control around the whole industry. I think that will be much wanted, so that you have this sort of flight to quality, which again often happens when you see these patterns in technology develop. And so I do think that what you're going to end up with is a sort of the maturing of the space is going to bring with it some more regulatory checks and balances, because that's really what people are seeking. But they're not going to want to give up in the entirety really what the essence of this decentralization is. So it's going to be a little bit of both.
So, well, we keep on talking about it as an industry, which of course it is an industry, but and perhaps to a certain extent, at least in these early days, it has been in the grand scheme of things, a relatively closed industry that kind of feeds off of itself. But we just had another episode in this series on supply chain, and we were exploring all the tremendous dysfunction in the supply chain and all the weaknesses and the brittleness of the supply chain that was exposed in the pandemic, and talking about how to rebuild these things. And a lot of that discussion was about all of the peripheral systems that impact supply chain, including trade finance and collateralization, insurance. And it seems to me that finance and banking are an incredibly important rail to support things like supply chain and logistics. Do you see DeFi growing and expanding and playing a role in other industries? And how quickly do you think that's going to happen? So,
let me give it to you in the stages that I can see, and I think that there's probably, maybe we can think of a really good example to maybe hook onto it. But we started with digital assets. We've grown into that. We had the ability to have a smart contract that you can then codify. Right? You can actually codify. You have a standard descriptor of an asset. You can then codify it. You build these digital building blocks, these Lego bricks that you can then put into business process. What does that mean? That actually means that you can take your financial services and embed them into your supply chain processes. And this is what we're working on right now. You can take, your procurement process. You can have a purchase order created, tokenized, digitized. It's there. And that purchase order, once it's created, you can automatically be creating perhaps a credit note against it. Maybe you do lending, maybe you're borrowing, maybe your financial services are automatically introduced and running off of the basis of the purchase order being created. And that's just one example, but you could follow the whole supply chain all the way through and think about taking automated financial services process and actually embedding it much closer into these, very familiar in some cases, these different steps within the supply chain. And then when you're doing it on a distributed network, of course, you have the transparency, you have scalability, you have a lot more transparency when you start to think about it. But you can see that you're really taking your financial services, they're embedded within these processes. Supply chain's one example. It crosses a number of industries, we know that. But I think you're going to see similar examples across the board, ultimately. And this is just the journey, it's the beginning. But I would see it the way that we think about it, and certainly the way that we're thinking about it within EY, is if you think that ERP, what ERP did inside of the boundaries of a company, what we're able to do now is create a similar sort of integrated systems and processes between companies and between organizations. And that's really what we all have to sort of start to get our head around and really see the benefits of that.
Yeah, I really like that analogy. I mean, when ERP systems came in, their core value proposition was that you have all these different departmental systems, and they all have completely siloized data. And if you put the whole thing on a big data backbone, and all the applications and all the different departments are just instantiations of the same underlying data, that it just solves so many problems and facilitates coordination and just cuts out a lot of cost and gives businesses a lot more flexibility. And what you're saying, I think, is a great analogy that this Web3 blockchain technology is to ecosystems what ERP systems were to enterprises. And I think that's a great way of looking at it. And so DeFi is one of those component pieces. Now, I mentioned that I had been talking to a bunch of banks, and it was kind of interesting. I was talking to a bank, and it was they brought me in as part of a 2-day strategy cycle, strategy meeting, and I was halfway through the second day, and I asked them what they had covered in the first day, and they kind of talked about we talked, we kind of created a list of our core value propositions, and I said, "Oh, what are the core value propositions?" And they said, "Well, number one was trust. We've built our brand on trust." And that makes total sense in, the world we've been living in for the last 100 years. But, the question is, well, what happens when trust is an inherent characteristic of a network, right? And it's a very interesting question. So, if you kind of think about what's going on in the DeFi space and its ability to very cost effectively and very quickly address economic niches and reduce transaction costs and allow for, new modalities of interaction that just didn't exist before. It does a lot of kind of experimentation at the public and reconfiguring very, very quickly. It starts to suggest, to me at least, that the banking industry is going to have to be fundamentally restructured, that traditional banks are going to be relegated to providing kind of core banking services, and this pantheon of companies that will start to surround it as an ecosystem that will be actually interacting with businesses and consumers and composing many, many different kinds of complementary offerings: banking services, insurance services, financial services, utility services, et cetera. Do you see that happening? I mean, is DeFi potentially that disruptive?
So, my view is that DeFi is going to be extremely disruptive to the industry. Now, and I would say that doesn't necessarily mean that it's only a threat to big banks, right? I mean, I think what you're saying is they should be all the sirens should be going off, and they should be feeling this disruption, right? There's also a huge opportunity for the banks here, and this goes back again to my belief that ultimately we'll end up with a melding of services. We're consumers and we like choice, and what we've just done is extended our choice in financial services, and I don't know that that's going to go away for a while. We've got to understand that for many people still, the DeFi world is still very complex to maneuver yourself in, right? Predominantly, the very early movers in it tended to be tech people or people that can understand the technology. The banks have a huge role to play, right? You mentioned 100 years they've been building up that trust. They've also learned a thing or two in that time. And, so I think that the important way to think about it is, yes, the industry is going to be disrupted. The way that we interact, the type of services that we have, what's possible from a financial service has just changed. There's a whole slew of new services that can be offered much more cheaply, more efficiently, and more simply, with fewer steps involved, right, than we had previously. the winners, which I think is where I would get to, are those that are going to be able to make those two worlds become seamless, right? I think the winners are going to be the ones that are best able to provide consumers and provide their customers with a very consumable, easy to access, easy to understand set of choices. And that's really something that the banks have done really well at. They've done extremely well in, if you look back in history of being able to define out very complex offerings very simply for their customers, so they're able to buy into it. And so I don't think that you can rule it out. I just feel that what you're going to see is a shift, and what you'll see is a change and a morphing of what the breadth of services look like. What does, investment banking look like? What does, cross-border trading look like? We can already see it today, right? And there's a lot of banks that are already leaning in on this, and they're leaning in with good reason because they can see they also have an opportunity to lead here.
Well, so that makes eminent sense to me. And on your last point, we already see them leaning in. I mean, if the top 20 banks in the world have collectively taken many billions of dollars of equity investment positions in all kinds of protocols and DeFi companies, and so they're actively participating and investing into that space. So I completely buy into that. I also think that it's probably likely that that banks, a lot of their core business is still going to be core banking services, and that those ones that will really excel will structure their systems so that they're highly composable, so that all of these DeFi companies and ecosystem partners can easily interact with those systems, and that they'll differentiate themselves.
I agree, but I would also say though that that sort of rethinking, reimagining of core banking systems, I mean, that again already started with the fintechs, right? So I think that we shouldn't look in isolation at DeFi as being the disruptor to the way that banks operate today. I actually think there's a number of different sort of influencing factors that are coming into what will reshape the form of them and how they operate, and really what that underlying model that they're working to, I think, is going to go through and is already going through enormous change in the banks. I mean, you can see it. There's a very good reason why banks have to spend as much as they do, and are certainly now not holding back on their tech investment funding. Right? I mean, tech investment for the big banks is as high as it's ever been right now.
Well, I think that makes eminent sense. So, where do you think we go from here? Things. Wow, I'm Tinkerbell waves her magic wand. Right?
Yeah. So there's no crystal ball. We don't have a crystal ball, but what I would say is, the first step was very much around sort of almost reproducing what already exists in traditional finance. So within DeFi, what you saw were a lot of the services that were built were really about sort of replicating what was already in traditional finance, and so you had, digital exchanges, and we talked a little bit about lending. Albeit that lending looks and feels a little different in the DeFi world, because you're able to, you can issue credit and lend with this anonymous aspect to it, which means that you're able to do this peer-to-peer lending, a little that you were into, which fundamentally changes. You're bringing into the picture people that perhaps otherwise would have struggled to be able to meet the bar of KYC and some of these other factors, right? So you're sort of democratizing what you have. Where are we going? I think, as I was talking about before on supply chains, I think what you're going to see is the evolution of beyond the financial services and the new financial services that are going to evolve coming out of this whole process. You'll then start to move into these really embedding and codifying financial services within business process. And that's going to become a very exciting time, I think, for many companies, and in the way we interact and the speed that we interact, and rethinking some of the process steps of the way that we do business today. And I think that there's both a big demand, which is always a positive thing to pull through. But also there's this savviness out there. People are very coming, out of the last 2 years, companies and their ability to digitally transact has saw this phenomenal growth. So I also think there's a digital savviness that's going to mean that this transition, I think, is going to come. And the technology is maturing to that level. So we're starting to get to scale. We're starting to get to privacy on Ethereum. So when we come through these milestones, I think you're going to start to see really this sort of spreading, if you like, into other industries.
Well, it sounds really exciting. I mean, it sounds like that we're entering an era of, extraordinary, maybe even unprecedented innovation and change. And I think you certainly seem to be suggesting there's going to be lots of opportunities that are going to emerge in this new world. A lot of
opportunity.
Yeah,
definitely.
Well, that's I'm invigorated. That sounds really exciting. Thank you, Claire, for helping us delve into this fascinating topic. And thank all of you for joining us for this episode of W3B Talks. You can find research on this and other topics at the blockchainresearch.org. I'm your host, Doug Heintzman. We hope you'll join us for our next episode of W3B Talks.